Well, for more on this, we have Robert Patman, Professor of International Relations at University of Otago, joining us live from New Zealand. Professor Patman, thank you so much for joining us. Well, let's start off with this question.
Welcome.
Why do you think the AUKUS members have really refrained from expanding the security pact, except to really include Japan into its circle?
Well, the AUKUS Security Pact's been in operation for it was established in September 2021. And I think there's several obstacles to immediately expanding the pact. Firstly, the US has quite tight restrictions on sharing technology. And while those hurdles have been cleared for the UK and Australia, that could be quite a lengthy process in Washington. So I think that that's quite a short-term obstacle, perhaps a medium-term obstacle to immediately expanding AUKUS. I think the second thing is one of the members, particularly Australia, is quite concerned about the difficult task of acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. The Virginia-class submarines will not start arriving in Australia to about 2033, and it's a very expensive undertaking for Australia. And I think a third factor concerns a certain degree of uncertainty related to US domestic politics. I think some members of AUKUS are quite nervous and don't think it's the appropriate time to bring in new members, full new members, when we still don't know who will win the US election. If Mr. Trump wins the presidency in November, that could have implications for AUKUS going forward.
Well, so there is some volatility in that sense, but how do you think Japan can contribute to the alliance, and which aspects could it be involved in?
Well, I think Japan, it's the fourth largest economy in the world. It has excellent bilateral relations with the three existing AUKUS members, and particularly, of course, the most important AUKUS member, the United States. In addition, Japan has very good relations with NATO, a multilateral security alliance of which the US is the major player. So all in all, I think Japan is seen as a very attractive partner. And what we know from recent developments is that Japan could be included in exploratory discussions regarding Pillar 2 of AUKUS. But that's not confined to Japan. Other countries are also exploring the prospects. Canada and New Zealand have also weighing up possible participation in Pillar 2. But it seems at the moment we're not going to have any hard decisions about new membership. But we may get, on a case-by-case basis, we may get sort of partial associate membership, I should say, of AUKUS for one or two countries which are currently not within AUKUS.
Well, Professor, let's turn the table slightly. We're talking about how AUKUS is gaining from Japan, but Japan, as you mentioned, is world's fourth biggest economy, yet only the ninth biggest defense spender. How does Japan gain from joining the pact?
Well, I think Japan's very concerned about Chinese assertiveness in the Indo Pacific, and I think Japan would, well, it's already a part of what's called the Quad. And I think it would welcome participation at a time of growing uncertainty. AUKUS, we should remind our viewers, AUKUS was formed in September 2021 to strengthen what's called the international rules-based order. And I think Japan has a considerable stake in that order. It has tended to have very strong security relations with the United States, but also participate actively in the rules-based order. And so it's very concerned, I think, about China's, the perceived Chinese assertiveness.
Well, the assertiveness is definitely one that we can't move away or unsee. But China has called the pact dangerous. Why do you think it is threatened by the pact and is so concerned that more countries could join AUKUS?
Well, I think Japan is very concerned because it sees AUKUS as an attempt to contain and deter China. And so China feels that it's the target of AUKUS. And the Chinese leadership believe that this is a bit of what they call a Cold War mentality. And I suppose they may see the prospect of complicating relations because of AUKUS with countries which they've had strong commercial ties with. Australia is one of them. New Zealand's another one, if New Zealand was to join as a Pillar 2 member. So many countries have very strong trade relations with China, and I think China would see this as an attempt to contain it within the Indo Pacific. I'm not sure it would be a successful attempt because the Indo Pacific contains 60% of the world's population, and it is always a bit of a stretch to expect 3 English-speaking countries to contain a country as formidable as China in a part of the world where there's about 40 countries. So I think a lot of countries are concerned about China, but they're not necessarily convinced that AUKUS is the best vehicle for countering Chinese influence in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, speaking of AUKUS being the best vehicle in terms of looking at the Indo-Pacific region, China says that the Pact could spur a regional arms race. What's your thought? What do you think of this? And do you think China is overreacting, perhaps?
Well, I think there's a concern, not just in China, but in a number of countries in the Pacific Island states, and also members of ASEAN are concerned that there's been loopholes which may have been exploited in a non-proliferation pact so that 2 nuclear powers, Britain and the United States will be constructing with British designs nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. And that's seen as testing the boundaries of the non-proliferation treaty. And I think there are concerns, which I think maybe China is trying to reinforce in ASEAN countries. ASEAN is a nuclear weapons-free zone under a treaty of 1995, and there's the Treaty of Rarotonga, which also forbids nuclear weapons in the Pacific Island states. So a number of those countries in ASEAN and the Pacific Island states are worried that AUKUS may trigger nuclear proliferation. And China, to some extent, is responding to that anxiety by also reinforcing it.
Well, thank you very much for joining us and providing us with all this information. Robert Patman, Professor of International Relations at the University of Otago.